Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hard times. That's the times I think that we're in right now, or kind of in. I'm going to speak about that in just a second. I just want to say that you're listening here to the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Hard times. Yes. Where are we in the Messianic process? With all that's going on now regarding the corona pandemic, the left rising to power both in the USA and Israel, the confusion of the biological sexes, perversity, lack of morals, weak men, entitled youth, warped families, fake news, lockdowns, propaganda and censoring, and of course, the famous God is dead. Where are we in the Messianic process? You know, there's a very good saying my son actually brought up to me, and it was a quote from a post-apocalyptic novel called Those Who Remain by author G. Michael Hopf, describing the cyclical version or vision of history. This is the quote, and I think it's very, very apt. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So apt. So apt when you see the generations. I mean, I see the generation gap between me and my younger neighbors, our values, and these are people who share the same values with me, but still their outlook on life is so different in how to raise children even. It's just so fascinating to see, but I want to repeat that one more time. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. We'll be right back.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Where are we in the Messianic process? You're listening to the Tamar Yonah Show here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I read a quote by author G. Michael Hopf from his book, Those Who Remain, and I just think it's such an apt quote for the topic today, and that is, hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So we're seeing lots going on in the world today. We're tackling the coronavirus, pandemic. We're looking at entitled youth, warped families, fake news, censorship. God is dead, a mixture of the biological sexes, perversity, lack of morals. I mean, just go on and on what's going on in the world today. And so the question we're asking is, where are we in the Messianic process. So many people today from all religions are talking about how close we are. And we're going to be speaking now with Rivkah Lambert Adler. She's a freelancer journalist specializing in stories about Judaism and Israel. She's also the editor of 10 from the Nations and Lighting Up the Nations, both about the Torah awakening among non-Jews around the world. And you can follow her on Facebook. Welcome to the show, Rivkah Lambert Adler.
Thank you, Tamar. Good morning to you.
Good morning. All right. Well, Israel voted in a new government. In fact, we just had a stormy Knesset vote just a little while ago, actually, which is supposed to talk about the character of Israel and the defense of Israel. And this government, anyway, is a house of cards. But I want to ask you about the Messianic process and where all of this plays in. In this darkness that we're living in, you say that this was all predicted. So I'd like you to tell our listeners about that.
Sure. So I want to say something about that quote that you gave, though, because it makes it sound like it's this endless cycle. And that is actually not the way I understand things, because although God lives outside of time, we human beings experience time as a linear process, but even more than that, Jewish history tells us that there's a built-in endpoint, that this cycle doesn't continue forever and ever, amen.
Right.
So in Israel, in addition to the things you mentioned, so there's COVID, and more than that, there's the war over the vaccine. In Israel, we've dealt with the collapse in Meron, the collapse in the synagogue in Givat Zev, the collapse of the parking lot at Shaare Zedek Hospital, now the collapse of this building in Surfside, Florida, the mini war that we had with Gaza, the Guardians of the Wall, riots in mixed cities, this unbelievably rapid proliferation of anti-Semitism, plus this new and unstable coalition government in Israel. It's a lot, and it keeps coming at us. And
like
there was
birth pangs, right?
Again?
Like birth pangs right before a woman's giving birth, as they talk about in the
That's exactly where I'm going with this.
Okay.
So there's a rabbi who we called the Chafetz Chaim, who passed away in 1933. So that was between World War I and World War II. And he told us to expect that there would be rocky times before the appearance of the Messianic Redeemer. And he specifically said, this is a quote, he said, "The troubles and persecutions of the Jewish people will follow each other so closely that there will be no space between them. Just as for an expectant woman who is about to give birth, the more intense her contractions and her pain, so too the wheels of the era will turn faster at the times of the birth pangs of Mashiach, of the Messiah." So if you feel like we're living in a dark time, you're actually seeing things accurately. There's another saying of the rabbis that's in the Talmud that talks about how all of the things we're going to see in the period preceding the coming of the Messianic Redeemer. And he talks, and in this piece of text, the rabbis talk about insolence will increase and honor will wane. So we know, for example, that social media is a cesspool of vile, judgmental, disrespectful comments, and normal people feel free to make the most insensitive and brazen and harsh personal insults without any fear of reprisal. There's the cancel culture, the woke culture that silences anyone who speaks up against the narrative. Another prediction is that the government will turn to heresy, but rebuke will be non-existent. So those who rule or who have any power or influence, so that would include the media, deny the existence of God, rule with arrogance, establish the agenda, and silence anyone who doesn't conform. So as a journalist, I'm sure you're aware of this, and you're one of the few who is still feeling free and open. But most of mainstream journalism, at least in Israel and in the U.S., are filled with people who are silenced and people who are deplatformed and people who are not allowed to talk about certain things. So where journalism used to be an opportunity to challenge those in power, it's now become it's become co-opted.
Right.
There there are more predictions. Meeting places will become places of sexual immorality. What is entertainment today was pornography
Right.
yesterday. And a person who objects to that on any kind of moral grounds is scorned.
Right.
And
He's a
truth will be
racist.
laughed. All of these things, I could go on and on, but the end of this quote, which I really love and is a point I want to keep coming back to, is that seeing all this darkness as just, oh my gosh, the world is so terrible, it's so upside down, how in the world are we going to survive one more day? That will bring you to a place of depression and feeling just awful. But if you understand that these things were predicted as signs for us that we're getting closer and closer to the revelation of the Messianic Redeemer, to the good stuff that comes along with that, then it actually can uplift us, because we can see all this darkness, just like exactly what you said, like a woman in labor. When it starts to get really, really hard, she knows that the end is coming. And so all the fact that all of the things that we're experiencing were predicted, and they're coming, and they're coming, and they're coming, is, I think, is a reason to be optimistic, because we have a tradition that these are taking us somewhere. Now, there's work we have to do, but it's taking us somewhere, and that somewhere is the redemption.
Rivkah, you're talking about the darkness that we're in now, and you were talking about the perversity that we're seeing, the immorality, and if anybody speaks up against it, they're castigated, they're delegitimized, cancel culture, etc. And I was just thinking, what we call darkness, they call enlightenment. And it just reminds me of, like you say it, that in the end times they say that what's bad is going to be termed as good, and what's good is going to be thought of as bad. And that's just so apt that what we see as darkness, they look at as enlightenment.
It's ironic, but the work here is for us to get clear. I want to talk about the one of the reasons why evil has to intensify before the redemption, but it has to do with what happened in the Garden of Eden. And if we go back to the Garden of Eden and we see that originally good and evil were completely separate, distinct things, and it was very clear what was good and what was evil. And after the sin, after Adam and Eve ate from the fruit, good and evil, one of the consequences of that is that good and evil got kind of mashed together, and it became difficult to separate them. And what all of human history has been about, on at least one level, is learning how to separate these two things. And in order to go to this Messianic era, we have to, again, vanquish evil so that only good exists. So the blessing in what we're seeing in this darkness is that we are able, those of us that are coming from a biblical perspective or from a moral perspective, are able to more clearly identify what is evil. It's part of that process of separating these two things so that it becomes clear to everybody who is coming from a place of morality what is good and what is evil. There are a lot of confused people, I think, in the world. I don't know that they are there are the leaders and the stakeholders and the ones that are kind of running the show that are the true evil. There's just a lot of people who aren't thinking so clearly because they are detached from the Bible, because they're detached from God, because they're detached from morality. And so I think those people are salvageable, and they're just confused or misguided at this stage. And so those of us that have a biblical perspective on what is good and what is evil are have a big job to do to help them. It's not the time right now. Right now, it's just still a big mess. But eventually, we will vanquish evil in the world. That's something that our tradition promises us. And what will be left is just good.
Good and clarity, truth. That's what we'll know. God will be revealed in the world, and so our eyes will be much more opened than covered and confusing as we see today. So talking about confusion, we're going to be going to a break right now, but we're going to try to clear up this confusion, and we're going to talk about what the spiritual work is of this time period that we're in and what we need to learn. So our guest again is Rivkah Lambert Adler, and she's a freelancer journalist specializing in stories about Judaism and Israel. She's the author of the book 10 from the Nations and Lighting Up the Nations. And you can find her on Facebook. You can also write us at info@israelnewstalkradio.com, and we will send you the link to her Facebook page. Don't go anywhere, everybody. We're going to be right back.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and we're talking about where we are today in the Messianic process with all that's going on now regarding the corona pandemic, the building collapse in Florida, and the collapses that happened in Israel, one after another. We've had a war with the Hamas. We had a cable car that also collapsed off of its cords in Italy, where an entire Israeli family, almost an entire Israeli family, was tragically killed. We have elections both in the United States and Israel that is very left-wing and taking people away from conservative values and what we believe is moral and the right direction. So the question is, what is the spiritual work that we need to do in this time period of what many believe, from different religions as well, that we are indeed in the Messianic process? Our guest is Rivkah Lambert Adler. Rivkah, take it.
So a lot of people are still in the mindset. They notice the same, that whole litany, what you just shared. They notice that these things are happening. They're following the news. But where they are, where they're not actually fully activated is dealing with the problems that we have without considering the spiritual implications of the problem, which are the true cause. It's not going to help. So at least in the West, we tend to default to a concept that in Hebrew is called kochi va'otzem yadi, my strength and the power of my hands, without realizing that the situation is a spiritual one at its core. So what does that mean? It means that people tend to try to solve all of the problems that you've been talking about, that we've been talking about, the darkness that's in the world. They're trying to solve them using human resources. So as an example, during an election, especially in Israel, there's endless analysis of parties and coalitions and seats, as if we can figure out exactly what's needed to get a certain outcome, like as if it's in our power. But these things are in God's hands, not in ours. But as long as we think with our intelligence, with our hard work, with our influence, that we're the ones making things happen in the world, then our faith in God is faulty, and we still have work to do to be ready for the Messianic era. So we have to be shown over and over again, because we're not getting it, how God is absolutely in control of world events. And I think this is the challenge of our times. When here in Israel, when our synagogues and our schools and the airport and businesses were closed, we were meant to understand that God can take away anything in the blink of an eye, that nothing is in our control, that if any reliance that we have on cause and effect has to be undone before we can be ready for the Messianic period. We have to see that God is the only force that powers the universe. Like when the Torah was given, and the Jewish people stood at the base of the of Mount Sinai and saw God's oneness with absolute clarity, that there were no doubts, there were not even the slightest trust in anything that wasn't God. That's the clarity that we need at this point, that clarity that we need to be working on, because we have to get to the point where we stop having faith in anything that isn't God. One of the things that's in order to prepare ourselves for this period of time, for a time when we are in a more spiritual form of leadership than anything that we've experienced right now. Right now, we have human leaders who act as if they are setting the agenda, they're controlling everything. Their narrative is what's going to prevail. We the people who are preparing for this Messianic era, for this more spiritual form of leadership, we have to sever our reliance on anything that isn't God. That includes the government. It includes doctors. It includes the educational system, the media. And for those who are vaccine averse, COVID has proven to be an excellent tool for decreasing our reliance on every one of these systems, because they've all let us down. If you are of the mind that there's a lot of lies, there's a lot of manipulation, there's a lot of pressure around the vaccine, and the expectation that everybody should have it regardless of whatever medical decisions, medical autonomy that they had before, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to see that everything that is human, again, doctors, the government, the media, everything, it all has to dissolve before the Messianic ruler can take leadership in Israel. That is
a prerequisite.
Mm-hmm. So there's a phrase in the Talmud that the Messiah can't come until the lowly kingdom ceases. What is that lowly kingdom? It's understood to be a reference to the government of the state of Israel. And so right now we are in
the secular
government. Right, we're in this temporary stage. So we know that, you know, when the Messiah is here and he's the Messianic king over not just Israel but over the whole world, we forget that the forms of government that we have now, and this is true in America and it's certainly true in Israel, are only temporary. The fact that government is in the hands of fallible humans who seem to be taking us to dark places is if we're seeing correctly, we're seeing that this whole system has to dissolve, that we can't go into the Messianic era being led by the kinds of people who are in the secular government. And so all of this, losing reliance on anything that's not God, and knowing that darkness was predicted, which we talked about in the previous segment, losing reliance on anything that isn't God. And how do we prepare now? We disconnect ourselves from anything that is profane and connect ourselves as much as possible to anything that is holy. So the question for us is, where can you add light into the world? Where can you take your life and shape it towards being kinder to other people, being more connected to God? That's all part of our preparation. When we can clearly see what is destructive and limited and harmful to the future of humanity, then we can detach from it. So even though you and I both work in media, one of the biggest culprits of that, I think, is the twisted morality of the media at this particular time. And so even though it's part of what the work that we do, that we have to stay somewhat connected to what's going on in the world, if we see that not to get ourselves too caught up in the constant news cycle. First of all, who knows how much of what's being reported is even accurate, because we live in a time of
fake news.
Such fake news and so many lies.
Rivkah,
and so much. Yeah.
We're just about to go to a break, and we do have a caller that's been patiently waiting. Let's have him on really quickly. We have joining us William calling in from the United Kingdom. Shalom, William. What's your comment or question for us here at Israel News Talk Radio?
It says in the book of Daniel that the 4 kingdoms will rule over us. Well, all the royal families of the world, most of the billionaires, most our pop stars, rock stars, and world leaders are all Rh-negative bloodline. Yet Rh-negative is only 1 in 10 people, so why is there so many of them that rule over us? It goes back to the book of Daniel. They're the wicked ones, and they rule over us, Tamar, until the Moshiach comes. And when the Moshiach comes, he'll reveal this to the world.
Okay.
And then we'll know who the Nephilim are and the descendants of the Nephilim.
The Nephilim. Okay, thank you for your call, William. Do you want to make a quick comment before we go to a break, Rivkah?
No, I think he I don't know about the genetics of it, but there's clearly a group of people who are not godly people who think that they're running the show, and they are all eventually at the end of the story gonna be humbled.
Okay. I want to say that you were talking about the spiritual work, and basically in a time of such darkness as you were talking about, Rivkah, it's our job, as you said, to reveal God in the world, that there is a God. We need to reveal him and take out that darkness with the light of knowing that our Creator exists, and that there is a Creator, which so many people try to deny and bury and delegitimize anyone who wants to stand up for anything like that. And I was telling you during the break, I'm just sharing this with our listeners, that I see what's happening today with the left and rising with communism, the whole ideology of the government is the be-all. The government, which is like the collective, is higher than God. And I see this as the modern-day Tower of Babel people who said we're going to build a tower to reach the heavens and dethrone God, and we will take that seat, and we will become the masters of our own destiny. Who needs God? And that's what I see happening today. We're going to talk about more about this, how to prepare ourselves for what is coming. What is coming, by the way? That's the question. And how do we prepare ourselves when we get back from the break that we're going to be going to? Again, we're speaking with Rivkah Lambert Adler. She's the author of the book 10 from the Nations and Lighting Up the Nations. You can find her on Facebook. We're going to be right back.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Our guest is Rivkah Lambert Adler. She's a freelance journalist and author of the book 10 from the Nations and Lighting Up the Nations. And we're discussing where are we today in the Messianic process. And in the last segment, Rivkah, we were talking about the spiritual work of this time period that we're in, what we need to learn. And I want to ask you now also how we prepare ourselves for what is coming and, what is coming, and how does God remind us that he exists in this world? People can forget that there's a God. We don't see God necessarily. People are too busy with their lives or too distracted. So where would you like to start?
So there's this brand new book that just came out called The End Illuminated, and the subtitle is Current Events Within the Process of the Geula, of the Redemption, through the lens of Chazal, meaning the Jewish sages. It's by Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Sorotskin. And he talks about a certain pattern that we've seen before in history, that when God wants to teach us that he's the one running the show, he uses something small and insignificant. So he gave a couple of examples, and I'll take it into present times.
And that's to humble us, right? Not with something big, so it's too big for us, but something so small and insignificant that we're like astounded and humbled, right?
Right. So there was this big king, we call him Og, who's sort of this eternal symbol of superhuman strength and power. He was a king who was a giant. And in the Talmud, it says that he had this plan that he was holding a mountain above his head. That's how big and strong he was. And he was prepared to hurl it at the Jewish people. And the way God dealt with him was not with to match his strength like power to power. He brought him down with something unremarkable, which is ants, that God directed the ants to tunnel around the base of the mountain. So the center fell out. Fell onto his head, and that's how he was killed. So God took this giant, literally a giant, and said, I can bring you down. It's a lesson for us, right? I can bring you down with something so unremarkable as an ant. There's something also similar that happened with Titus. So Titus conquered the land of Israel. He destroyed the temple, and he was feeling pretty good about himself. He was traveling back to Rome on a boat when there was a storm that erupted, and he is arrogant, and he's taunting God, saying, you're only able to fight me at sea. You can't fight me on land. And God responds to him and says, I'm going to bring you down with the smallest of creatures. And so some tiny insect flew into Titus's ear, and began pecking at his brain. And the tradition is that for 7 years, this insect caused so much suffering and excruciating headaches until it eventually brought about his death. So these are two examples in history that Hashem shows us his power with he has control over not just big things, but tiny things. There's a tradition in Judaism that before the arrival of the Messiah, that God will send a tiny creature to prove to the nations of the world that they have no strength of their own. And what is that tiny creature? I obviously think that that's exactly what this COVID virus is one of the lessons of the COVID virus. We can't even see it with the naked eye, but it is changing the entire world. We have to understand that the coming of the Messiah and the Messianic redemption is a process. There's a lot of stuff that has to be cleaned up, a lot of work that God has to do in heaven in order to make way for the pureness and the cleanness and the goodness and so forth. But how our job here is, how do we protect our spiritual lives when all of this is going on? So we know, for example, that at least in the beginning, before people understood how much of manipulation this whole COVID thing has turned into, when we really thought it was a real threat, we worked to protect our physical lives. Most of us were careful about social distancing, wearing masks. In the beginning, remember, we used to wear gloves. Some people wiped down their groceries. We stayed very far away from each other.
That was me.
all of those things were things that we did when we thought that our physical lives were in tremendous danger. But how do we take that willingness to do things to protect ourselves and to prepare in a spiritual way, like not getting caught up in the news cycle and the social media war, living in alignment with the goals of the Messiah? How can we do that? So I mentioned before about leaning more into holy things and staying away from things that are not holy. So for a Jewish person, for example, that might mean spending more time being absorbed in Torah study. But anybody can do more kindness, to be good to people, to give more charity, to correct and improve one of their personality qualities that maybe isn't so good. Maybe they have a tendency to lie or to speak meanly to people, or to be lazy, or whatever the thing is. This is the time to be prepared. We live in a time, we spoke about this before, that people just don't see things the same, and that's fine, because we're not all created the same. But it is so important to bring back this quality of speaking to each other with respect, relating to each other, even people, especially people who we don't agree with, to relate to them in ways that show that we know that they are deserving of respect. And that is part of how we strengthen ourselves. If we're not prepared when the Messiah comes, we're going to have to go through this process in a much more difficult way. So preparing now is not getting caught up in the flare-ups that happen every day. If there's something you can genuinely do to impact the positive, do that. But we should be nurturing everything that's good in the world, everything that's holy, everything that's spiritual. Where can you in your life add light into the world? Because God's doing his part getting the whole world ready, but we have to be in alignment. We have to be in alignment with this idea that we're going someplace that that doesn't have all of these challenges. I want to read you just a quote that it comes from Rabbi Mendel Kessin, who I know has been a guest on your show many times. Mm-hmm. He did a class on why is there darkness before the end. And he said this: the world's envelopment in darkness means that the struggle is greater, and so the potential reward, the merit is greater. Truth is concealed, and yet one who still struggles to do a mitzvah, that is to do Hashem's will in the world, to have faith, to have trust in God. In an environment where most have abandoned God, the one who prevails has great merit. The reward is so great, it can, he says, fill up the amount of tikkun left to do, meaning if you're a person who is a godly person and you can see that what's going on here is just dark and you're trying to get through that, you should understand that anything you can do that's godly, that's positive, that's helpful to other people, that's kind, that is holy, anything you can do in that realm, you get even greater merit from God, because it's harder to do that. It's harder to do that because we're all sort of walking in this dark sludge of all the events. But these challenges are meant to push us to come closer to God in preparation for the Messianic leadership. We're meant to lose faith. I'm just reviewing the things we've talked about, to lose faith in anything that isn't God. And that means all human institutions have to fail us. It's part of the plan. And the more we strengthen ourselves spiritually during this time of darkness, the more we're doing to prepare the world for the Messianic era, and the greater our personal reward, exactly because it's hard. So we want to train ourselves to see that the evil that exists in the world, to see it accurately for what it is, which is the beginning of the end. And I would just conclude again with with this brief quote from Rabbi Kessin. He says, "We will see a light, see the divine presence in a way that's never been seen before." He calls it a staggering light, truth and holiness. God is revealed and it will never be dark again, and the Jews will reign supreme through the end of the Messianic era in the year 6000, and when the universe transforms into whatever's coming next. He says it's like someone who's been in prison and suddenly the cell door opens and he emerges into the daylight, that the exile will be over, the divine presence will be illuminated, and we can't imagine, he says, the majesty of that moment. And his promise to us is that it says in the book of Psalms that King David writes that for all the suffering that we've endured, God will reward us with the equal in holiness. So I'm happy to end on a light-filled, happy note, but just to remember that we're all being tested for what are we going to cling to? Are we going to cling to the schmutz and the upside down values and so forth that are
what's in vogue
in our world?
Yeah.
Or are we going to cling to God? Are we going to cling to what is light, what is good, what is holy? And
absolutely.
That's the challenge for all of us.
We really have to just hold on to the truth and not be swayed by peer pressure, by what's the mode, and just really be faithful to God. I want to thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Rivkah Lambert Adler. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.